Leviticus chapter 11.
So you don't have a copier here or anything like that?
Yeah, I do.
Do any of y'all, did you want me to burn this off for anybody? Or what do you think? Or do you think you don't want to take, I don't know.
I don't know.
Well, and I don't want to distract you from trying to get going.
Good morning. I'm Sharina, and I will be swabbing flies, looks like, this morning. Anyway, I will be leading the Bible study this morning. We are studying out of Knowing the Bible series. We are in Leviticus. I get mine at Mardell's. You can probably either pick them up or order them from any Christian bookstore. We are in chapter 11 of Leviticus. Last week we studied the priesthood, the beginning of the priesthood, and God's rules and regulations that he set up for that. This week we are in chapter 11. I believe this is the beginning of the purities. And the dietary laws is what we're studying today. So, one of the duties of the priesthood was the defining and teaching of clean and unclean. Leviticus chapter 11 instructs the priests on the differences between clean and unclean animals. Why an animal is placed in either category is not always clear. Some commentators hold the view that animals who chew the cud and were cloven-footed were more familiar to the Israelites, as that's the animals that they took care of and herded. These animals were also used in the sacrificial offerings. Most of the unclean birds are predators and carrion eaters. That's ones contacted with death and consuming blood. Of insects and swarming things, about the only clean things edible was locust and grasshoppers, which that's what John the Baptist ate when he was coming out of as he was in the wilderness before he started his ministry. Of the water, aquatic animals, the clean, and those were the ones having fins and scales, were what modern zoologists would call true fish today. Chapter 11 also introduces the defilement of people and things by coming into contact with, and especially dead animals and unclean things. In the case of an animal carcass, you would be unclean until the evening. While the death of Jesus relieves us of the need to limit our food to only clean animals, there is something to be said about dietary restrictions for health reasons. Doctors and scientists today use some of the focus on unclean animals as being unhealthy for our bodies. These dietary restrictions also provided a distinct difference between the Israelites and the people that would be living around them once they reached Canaan. God's people were to live a holy lifestyle before others. He is a holy God, therefore his people must remain holy or set apart. His people are still called to be set apart, but their differences is no longer Jews and Gentiles, but saved and unsaved. The dietary laws of the Israelites may not in themselves be relevant to our lifestyle today, but they are relevant to the finished work of the cross. Jesus Christ, when he took that last breath, removed all differences between mankind. In God's eyes, there is only one race, and that's the human race. and only two nations, and that's the saved and the unsaved. And that happened at the cross. All right, so my two commentaries are the Moody's Bible commentary and Worsby's Bible commentary. So these next sections will be from those commentaries, and I'll start with Moody. Chapters 11 through 15 detail God's instructions that we're to govern ritual purity, that which allows or disallows access to the encampment where God had taken up his residence. The dietary system in Israel, and that's all of Leviticus chapter 11, served God's purpose in making Israel distinct or different from the other nations by identifying pure and impure animals. The holy God differentiates between the clean and the unclean in the daily activities of his people as well as their diet. Chapters 12 through 15 identify human sources of impurity, their diagnosis, and ritual cleansings. The concept of clean and unclean first appears in Genesis 8, where God made this distinction between the animals that Noah brought into the ark. If you remember that story, he was to bring a certain amount, I think it was 2 pairs, male and female, of the clean and only one of the unclean. He wanted more clean than unclean animals in the world. Noah also understood enough to sacrifice clean animals after the flood. Care should be exercised in interpreting these texts, for not everything that is unclean is by nature sinful. Yet everything sinful is unclean in the sense of being unfit to enter the presence of the holy God. In other contexts, however, uncleanness refers specifically to acts of sin, such as found in Leviticus 18, verse 20 and verse 23. Do y'all want to look that up real quick, or you want me to go on?
Where's that?
Leviticus chapter 18, verse 20 and verse 23.
20 and 23?
18.
Okay. Moreover, you shall not lie
Carnally.
with your neighbor's wife to defile yourself with her, and you shall...
And then 23.
Oh,
Just verse 20
okay.
and then verse 23.
Okay. And nor shall you mate with any animal to defile yourself with it, nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is perversion.
And mine says confusion, and I think that's a very apt word. That's a little confusing.
Yeah.
Okay, just a little. Okay, and so these are such acts as are found unclean. It will make you unclean before a holy God. And when you're unclean, you can't come into the presence of a holy God. So, the Hebrew word for unclean is T-A-M-E with an exclamation point after the E, not over it. I thought that was strange. Anyway, to me it would be tame or tamei. But the meaning is abnormal, unnatural, weak, or ill. And the word for clean is taher, T-A-H-E-R. And that meaning is normal, clean, pure, or whole. Uncleanness is a dominant subject in Leviticus. The word unclean occurs 182 times in the Old Testament, and 2/3 of those are in Leviticus. The word clean occurs 92 times in the Old Testament, and half of those are in Leviticus. Certain animals, if consumed or touched, could render a worshiper unfit to enter God's presence, and mere contact with the corpse of an animal would render a person unfit to enter the Lord's presence. In Leviticus 11, cleanness and uncleanness are discussed in relation to food. Cleanness or uncleanness that is a result of contact with a dead animal is also mentioned, but it seems that the reason the dead animal is called unclean is because one could not eat it and remain ritually pure. So even a clean animal, one allowed to be for consumption, could not be eaten if it were not killed in a sacrificially prescribed way. Even a ceremonial clean person like a priest had needed to be elevated to holiness through sacrificial ritual in order to enter the Lord's presence. For something or someone to be clean meant that it or he was free from the abnormalities that could not by nature enter the presence of the Lord. This included imperfections, weakness, illness, and such as that. Also, certain animals were precluded from Israel's diet and rituals. Why certain were considered clean and others not is debatable. Answers to that include these animals were used in pagan rituals, or concern for health and hygiene, or they symbolically represented representations in the case for unclean. However, dogmatic assertions about the reasons behind excluding certain animals should be avoided. The Lord declared them to be clean or unclean, thereby providing yet another way for Israel to be separate and distinct from the other nations. And that's found in Leviticus 11:44 through 45. If we want to go ahead and read it, or if we want to wait till we get to it.
I can read it.
Okay.
For I am the Lord your God, so you must consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. Do not defile yourselves by any swarming creature that crawls on the ground. For I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God, so you must be holy, because I am holy.
And there, I don't know how many times we've run across that phrase so far in Leviticus. He is a holy God, and he expects his people to be holy. And I think when one of the first times we ran across it, I made the comment that God hasn't changed. He still wants his people to be holy. Only now we're his people. We're his nation of holy people.
I don't know, whenever I hear that, I always, basically, it's just he wants us set apart. He wants us to be different.
Exactly.
Not that we're perfect.
No, we're
Because
never
we're
going to
not.
be perfect, but he
Right.
wants the world to be
Yeah.
able to look at our lifestyle and the way we live and say there's something different about them. That's what he wants. Well, that and obedience. But if you have the obedience, you will have the set apart, because that's a part of being obedient, is his will. All right, the concept of uncleanness in Leviticus 11 refers to something that does not function according to its normal or expected behavior. For land animals, and this will be when we get to it, verses 1 through 8, normal characteristics include cloven hooves, in other words, they're split into two sections, and cud chewing or rumination. For aquatic animals, the standard was fins and scales. Such uncleanness should not be considered sinful as such, but unclean in the sense of physical irregularities that render an animal unfit for Israel. The camel, the chafin or rock badger or hyrax, and the rabbit were declared unclean because they did not have cloven hooves. And we'll see that in verses 4 and 6. The standard for other animals mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 4 and 5. And so why don't we look at that right quick? Deuteronomy, it's a book or two past Leviticus.
16.
Chapter 14, verses 4 and 5. I like to make y'all look things up. That way I know you know how to use your Bible.
Numbers, Deuteronomy.
That's right. So 4 says, "These are the animals which you may eat: the ox, the sheep, and the goat, the deer, the gazelle, the roe deer, the wild goat, the mountain goat, the antelope, and the mountain sheep. And you may eat every animal with cloven hooves, having the hoofs split into 2 parts, and that chews the cud among the animals. Nevertheless, of those that chew the cud or have cloven hoofs, you shall not eat such as these: the camel, the hare, and the rock hyrax.
Yeah.
For they chew the cud, but do not have cloven hoofs. They are unclean for you. Also the swine is unclean for you, because it has cloven hoofs, yet does not chew the cud.
Right.
You shall not eat their flesh or touch their dead carcasses." Is
Okay,
that it?
so that just gives you a further list than I think in Leviticus it just has the part about the clean or the cloven hoofs and chew the cud. But if they have the cloven hoof and don't chew the cud, they're unclean. If they chew the cud but don't have the cloven foot, they're unclean. But they don't go into a list of them. So that was the reason for putting that in there.
A lot
Where
of
it
this
was.
has changed.
Huh?
You know, once you went to the New Testament, because I know now we eat rabbits. You know,
In the
used to
New
be
Testament,
confused.
I think it was.
yeah.
I think it was in Acts when when Cornelius had sent people to go and find Simon Peter, and he had a vision. He was upstairs on the roof at prayer time waiting for a meal, and he was hungry, and the meal wasn't ready yet, and he had this vision of a sheet coming down 4 corners filled with all of the foods of the world. And a voice said, "Here, take and eat." And he said, "Oh no, my Lord, unclean or common has never passed my lips. I'm not starting now." But that was when
It was a symbolic vision. Yeah.
Well, the thing about it was, it was because the whole point of it was, and at that point it was when he told him, if God has blessed it, you can't make it common. No one shall make it common. And so that was with the food. But the lesson there was, don't get hung up on differences. I mean, it really was. Yeah, if you're putting a stumbling block in someone's way by eating pork, don't eat pork. You know. But and it's the same way with drinking wine. If by you having a glass of wine tells the person across the room that knows you, hey, you're drinking and you're a Christian, and so it makes them think you're a hypocrite, that's putting a stumbling block in the way. And we shouldn't do those things. But it doesn't necessarily, the Bible doesn't necessarily preclude you from drinking a glass of wine. It does say don't be drunk.
And this was when that he was turning to the Gentiles and saying,
right, and that's
I
why
have
that whole
died for
thing
them
was there.
too. And so
Yes.
he was saying they're not off limits anymore. And
Yeah.
he didn't realize that. That's what they were.
Yeah.
What he was saying.
Yeah, and see that was the whole thing. Ordinarily, he wouldn't have set foot in Cornelius's house.
Right.
But God told him specifically, there are some men coming for you, and you're to go with them.
Right.
And
Thank God
but
he
and
did.
I think
Can you
yeah,
imagine?
well, and I think that experience is what taught Peter that our God is a God for everyone, and that happened when Jesus died on the cross. Because before then, God, His chosen people were the Jews, the Israelites, and they were the only nation that was set apart. But when Christ died on the cross, Gentiles became able to join that.
We
but
were
actually,
drafted in.
we made a whole new religion because it includes Jews and Gentiles alike. Jews can still accept Christ, but Gentiles now have that opportunity where they didn't before. So, and that's where the whole world was blessed by the seed of Abraham. God said, by your seed the world will be blessed. And that's how we now have the opportunity to accept Christ, to become a part of that kingdom. Now, where did I leave off at?
Let's see. You had gone to Deuteronomy.
Okay, there we go. The use of the definite article in Hebrew in association with these indicates that this refers to a class of animal rather than to a specific species of animal. The camel was employed by many Arabic peoples as a sacrifice, and its meat was eaten throughout the Middle East. The forward motion of fish, and that this is talking about verses 9 through 12, is normally by means of fins and scales. Some marine animals do not move through water by these normal means. Therefore, they were considered unclean. God had a strong word for the required Israelites' response to such unclean aquatic animals. They were to regard them as detestable or abhorrent. Both used to translate the Hebrew word segetz, it's S-H-E-G-Q-E-T-Z, used of detestable things in the sense of ceremonially unclean and therefore abominable. Birds of prey in verses 13 through 19 were prohibited from the Hebrew diet because they eat flesh with its blood. And the Hebrews, if you remember, were told never to eat anything with its blood. Make sure its blood is drained. So Leviticus 11, verses 20 through 23, deals with insects that dart about on all fours, which were also called detestable, but no reason was given for this. Perhaps it was because of their erratic, haphazard motion. By contrast, locusts, cricket, and grasshoppers, which moves by jumping hind legs, were permitted. Such insects were clean and formed a regular part of John the Baptist's diet in Matthew chapter 3, verse 4. And I don't know if y'all are all familiar with that or not.
That sounds yucky. I'm sorry.
Well, but you have to understand, locust and grasshopper was a
Delicacy.
all right, I can't say that word this morning. Anyway, it was a preferred, but it was roasted and coated in honey and
It probably was delectable.
well, it was probably delicious. It's not something I would want to eat just because of the sound of it. But, I mean, we're spoiled. Let's face it, you know. These people were trying to stay alive. They wanted something in their belly.
I'm sorry, but though I don't really think a cricket would be much of a
You don't see how that'd be much of a meal? Well, if you had a dozen or so, it might help.
That just sounds horrible.
But yeah, I get what you're saying too. But nuts and berries and the I think the locust and grasshoppers were where he got his protein from when he was in the
Right.
wilderness.
Raymond?
Thank God, no, just some telemarketing.
Now I've lost myself again. Okay, there we go. In Leviticus chapter 11, verses 24 through 28, the focus moves from living animals to dead ones. Carcasses of animals were to be considered unclean, the exception being animals appropriately slaughtered in ritual sacrifice with the blood also properly handled. All corpses pollute and contaminate because death is not natural to the presence of God. Washing and a period of isolation, most times until evening, were required. Now verses 29 through 38 deals with small animals such as moles, mice, lizards, and that kind of animal, situated close to the ground that swarm in hordes. Pollution accompanied such swarming and affected any article, clothing, or vessel that came into contact with these creatures. This transmitted temporary uncleanness that affected persons and things lasting until evening. Even carcasses of clean animals were defiling if they died of natural causes, and that's found in verse 39. A person who touched or ate a part of the carcass of a clean animal was also unclean until evening, and that's found in verse 40. The command to refrain from eating or touching unclean animals is stated again in verses 41 through 43, followed by the reason. The Lord is holy. The believer should be holy because the God who delivered him from eternal destruction is holy. The only restriction on New Testament believers concerning food is love for one's brother. And that's found in Romans 14:15 and 1 Corinthians. Or no, not Corinthians. I think it may be Colossians. But it's only got the chapters 8 and 10, and I don't want to read 2 chapters right now. So, God's redeemed people are to imitate his holiness. Verse 45 gives 3 reasons for avoiding unclean things. Reason number 1, God redeemed his people from Egypt. That is, they are uniquely his. Number 2, he is their God. And number 3, he is holy. So now Wiersbe says, the Israelites feared lest they become ceremonially unclean because of something they had touched or eaten. From birth to burial, they had to submit every aspect of their daily lives to the authority of God, God's law. Nothing was left to chance in the camp of Israel, lest someone be defiled. In order to maintain ceremonial purity, each person had to obey God's law in several areas of life. And stop to think about that. How many times can we even get our members of the church to do a certain thing that the church must do, you know? So think about a whole nation. Every person in that camp had to submit to that authority at several points in their lives. The main purpose of the dietary code was to remind the Israelites that they belonged to God and were obligated to keep themselves separated from everything that would defile them. Be holy, for I am holy. And that's Leviticus 11, verse 44. It says also see Deuteronomy 14, 3 through 20 for a parallel list of clean and unclean foods. But I think that we've already read that. Nevertheless, the spiritual principle of separation from defilement applies to the people of God today. The fact that we know God must make a difference in every aspect of our lives. For you were bought at a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. And that's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 20 in the New King James Version. Therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. And that's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31. God hasn't given his church a list of clean and unclean things, but he has revealed enough to us in his word to help us to know what pleases him and what grieves him. Three facts should be noted about the dietary laws. Fact number one, God gave these laws to the Jewish nation, to the Israelites or the Jewish nation. Fact number two, obeying them guaranteed ceremonial purity, but didn't automatically make the person holy in character. And number three, the laws were temporary and were ended on the cross of Christ. And that's found in Colossians chapter 2, verse 14. The choice the Israelites had to make was pleasing themselves and being unclean, or pleasing God and being clean. Today, we have to get our direction from God, not from other people. And we have to be willing to be different. We either choose to obey God and please him, or to disobey God to please ourselves. Our desire should be to please the Lord joyfully, not grudgingly. The first step toward disobedience is often reclassifying sin and making it look acceptable instead of abominable. For example, God said that the tree in the midst of the garden was off limits to the man and woman. But Eve saw that the tree was good for food in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. And took the fruit, and spiritual death entered the world. God said all the spoils of Jericho were under divine restriction and not to be touched by the Jewish soldiers. And that's in Joshua chapter 6, verses 16 through 19. But Achan revised that classification and took some of the spoil. And you find that in Joshua chapter 7, verses 16 through 26. It cost him his life. Samuel told King Saul to slay all the Amalekites and their flocks and herds, but the king kept Agag alive and kept the best of the sheep and of the oxen to give to the Lord. And that's found in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 15. Saul reclassified what God had said was abominable and thought that would make it acceptable. But his folly caused him to lose his kingdom. Today we live in a society that rejects moral absolutes and promotes a fluid morality that isn't morality at all. Like the people described in the book of Judges, and it says everybody is doing what is right in their own eyes. And that's found in Judges chapter 21, verse 25. But society's reclassifying of sin hasn't changed anything. God still calls sin an abomination, and he still judges sin. If the Jewish people were to keep themselves clean and pleasing to the Lord, they had to exercise discernment. This meant knowing God's word, respecting it, and obeying it. Fathers and mothers had to teach their children the law and warn them about the things that were unclean. This is found in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 1 through 9. We can read it if y'all want to, or we can wait till we get that lesson. Okay. Sorry. I usually turn that off. The priest had to teach the people and to remind them of the commandments of the Lord. The Jews had to remind themselves every hour of every day that they belonged to Jehovah, the true and living God, and that belonging to the nation of Israel was a high and holy privilege. And you can find that in Leviticus chapter 11, verse 44 in the New International Version. We'll get to that here in a little bit. In the New Testament language, it is walk worthy of the calling with which you were called, found in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1. Obeying God's law isn't a burden, it is a privilege. The Old Testament Jew, like the New Testament Christian, was not to walk as other Gentiles walk in the vanity of their minds, found in Ephesians 4, chapter 4, verse 17. It was a temptation to go along and then imitate the pagan practices of the heathen nations. And this led to Israel's defilement and discipline. I fear that the church today is following the same philosophy and becoming more and more like the world. G. Campbell Morgan was right when he said the church did the most for the world when the church was the least like the world. Jews who exercised spiritual discernment would walk in love. And that's found in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 2. And their love for the Lord would motivate them to obey his law. Each morning, the Orthodox Jew would recite what they called the Shema, which is the official Jewish confession of faith. And it goes like this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. And that's found in Deuteronomy 6, chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. This is still the first great commandment, and it's almost exactly word for word like it in Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 through 40. Like Israel in the Old Testament, believers today must not only walk worthy of their calling and walk in love, but must also walk circumspectly. And there's some more words that goes after that. Understanding what the will of the Lord is, and that's found in Ephesians 5, verses 15 and verses 17, and that little ... is what goes between 15 and 17. We must keep our eyes open and look around carefully, lest we defile ourselves. Mature believers can exercise discernment, identify that which is unclean, and avoid it. Remember, children are prone to walk in the mud and get filthy. What the prophet Hosea said about Israel in his day is true of many professed Christians today. And what he said was, "You stumble day and night, and the prophets stumble with you. My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge." And that's Hosea chapter 4, verses 5 through 6. But solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. And that's in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 14. Commenting on 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 13 through 16, Vance Havner said, "Nothing is more rare in churches today than discernment. The natural man knows nothing of it. The carnal man is devoid of it. Only the spiritual man has it, and we have all too few of those in that category." And so that's the study portion of what my own studies have come to. We will move to our book now and see if we can answer some questions. And this is where we're going to be doing most of the reading that, nope, I lost my place. There I am. So I'll read the first two paragraphs in the place of the passage in the big picture, and then we'll go to the questions. If y'all will get your Bibles to chapter Leviticus 11, we will start probably with verse 1. Okay. In the previous sections, Leviticus described the sacrifices of Old Testament worship. In the next section, we are introduced to the Old Testament priesthood. Without suitable priests to perform its rituals, the tabernacle would be like a machine with gears and pistons but no motion. The priests must keep the tabernacle operating. The next section of Leviticus describes the ordination of the first priest, and that was in chapter 8. Oh, wait a minute. I went back to last week's lesson. Let me start over.
Where are you?
Yes, week 5, clean and unclean. All right, the place of the passage. Toward the end of the previous section, the Lord gave Aaron these instructions. You are to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean, and you are to teach the people of Israel. And that was Leviticus chapter 10, verses 10 and 11. These two categories are the focus for the next several sections of Leviticus chapters 11 through 15. Contains laws about distinguishing clean and unclean, purity laws is what they're called. And chapters 17 through 20 contain laws about distinguishing holy and common. The purity laws extended Israel's acted theology beyond worship into daily life. The rituals of worship expressed Israel's fellowship with the Lord in his house. Purity laws taught Israel to live as God's forgiven people in their own houses. The New Testament apostles set aside these purity laws because they were temporary object lessons, superseded by the reality to which they pointed, which was to the cross, completed in the work of Christ. Like sacrifices, purity laws are no longer applicable to Christian practice. But like sacrifices, purity laws still offer rich insights into the work Christ came to accomplish. For additional discussion of the categories clean, unclean, holy, and common, see I can't say it.
Oh, no.
Can't say it.
What,
It's in your book. Yeah, thank you.
Interpretive.
Issues in the ESV Study Bible, which I've got one here if y'all want to take a look at that. The first set of purity laws distinguish clean and unclean animals with particular concern for the household diets of those living in the camp around the tabernacle. And the big picture is, as the society of God's favor, Israel was a royal nation living like privileged nobility around God's palace. All right, so Leviticus, we'll go into the questions. Leviticus orders its dietary regulations by realms. Land is 11:2-8. Water is verses 9-12. And air is verses 13-23. We're going to have to read all of those, so y'all look up decide among yourselves whether you're going to do air, land, or water, and look up those verses.
I'll do the first one.
You'll do land. Who wants to do air?
I can do it.
You do air, then Lisa, that leaves you with water, okay?
Okay.
Okay, so the land is verses 2-8. The water is verses 9-12. And the air is verses 13-23.
Okay.
Everybody got their verses?
I
Yeah.
think so.
Okay, so what we're doing here is they want to know how these realms compare to those of creation in Genesis, and I will do Genesis.
Do you want me to reread mine or not? Or?
I want you to read 2-8.
Okay. Tell the Israelites, you may eat all these kinds of land animals. You may eat any animal with divided hooves and that chews the cud, but among the ones that chew the cud or have divided hooves you are not to eat are these. Camels, though they chew the cud, do not have divided hooves, they are unclean for you. Hyraxes, though they chew the cud, do not have hooves, they are unclean for you. Hares, though they chew the cud, do not have hooves, they are unclean to you. Pigs, though they have divided hooves, do not chew the cud, they are unclean for you, and do not eat any of their meat or touch their carcasses, they are unclean for you.
Okay, so then water is next, verses 9-12.
Says of all the creatures living in the water, of the seas and streams, you may eat any that have fins and scales, but all the creatures in the seas or streams that do not have fins and scales, whether among all the swarming things or among the other living creatures in the water, you are to detest. And since you are to detest them, you must not eat their meat, and you must detest their carcasses. Although living in the water, they do not have fins and scales, and is to be detestable to you.
And then, air?
Mm-hmm.
And that's verses 13-23.
Okay. And these you shall regard as an abomination among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination, the eagle, the vulture, and the buzzard. The kite and the falcon after its kind, every raven after its kind, the ostrich, the short-eared owl, the seagull, and the hawks after its kind, the little owl, the fisher owl, and the screech owl, the white owl, the jackdaw, and the carrier vulture, the stork, the heron after its kind, the hoopoe, and the bat. All flying insects that creep on all fours shall be an abomination to you. Yet these you may eat of every flying insect that creeps on all fours, those which have jointed legs above their feet with which to leap on the earth. These you may eat, the locust after its kind, the destroyer locust, after its kind, the cricket after its kind, and the grasshopper after its kind. But all other flying insects which have 4 feet shall be an abomination to you.
Okay. Now, y'all bear in mind what we've just heard, what we've just read, because the object of this is to compare those sentences or those passages with Generations chapter 1 verses 20 through 25. So as I'm reading those, y'all think about what the comparisons can be, okay? All right. And God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. And God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let the fowl multiply in the earth. And the evening and the morning were the 5th day. And God said, let the earth bring forth the living creatures after his kind, cattle and creeping things, and beasts of the earth after his kind. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. So, what are your thoughts on comparisons?
I don't know when they got ungood, when they became an abomination to us.
This is pre-fall though, in Genesis 1.
Exactly.
So that's what I would say.
When Eve ate the apple and when Adam ate the apple is when clean and unclean. Yes, that's when sin entered the world. Now it didn't make them unclean at that time, but it did later on. I mean, the ark was after that, which destroyed everything except the animals. But it was at the ark that was God first mentioned clean and unclean animals.
Right.
So at the creation, everything was good.
Clean.
In God's eyes, everything was good.
Well, you sort of wonder if it was when the fall happened and when sin came into the world. You sort of wonder if certain things became clean.
I imagine that was the
And I
beginning
don't
of the
know that.
decline, just
Right.
like in
Yeah.
our world
It's like-
today. You look back
Right.
over the past 50 or 60 years, and there's a world of difference between society, government, even animals, and new discoveries of fish and all of this stuff over the last 50 or 60 years. It's a totally different world. So I'm sure that after sin entered the world, it wasn't bam, everything was bad.
Right.
It was a gradual procession. The world got so bad is why God sent the flood. Is because the people of the world had gotten so bad that there was no one righteous other than Noah.
Right.
And so he destroyed the entire earth and started over again with the animals that he told Noah to bring into the ark and with his family. So, but it does mention that the first time an unclean animal was mentioned in the Bible was in Genesis chapter 8, and that was when God was instructing Noah to the animals to bring and how many and all of that. And that was the first time that an unclean animal was pointed out. So I probably took until that time to make them unclean. I don't know.
Right.
But the thing you have to understand too, the deal with the dietary laws was actually to be a constant reminder to the Jewish people of all God had done for them, and that they were to remain holy, because they wanted Moses invited him to come and live with them. God was fine up there in heaven. The people, and Moses in particular, wanted God with them and wanted a sign that the people could always see, the pillar of light and the pillar of fire.
Well, it's pillar of fire.
Pillar of fire by night. And what did they follow by day? The cloud?
It was.
No. It was the presence of the Lord anyway, in whatever form or fashion. But Moses asked God to dwell with them so that the people could see for themselves, and wouldn't get discouraged and thinking they were left because God was there with them, So, and that's what made it necessary for them to keep themselves holy, is the presence of God was there with them. And if he was going to be there, then they had to be holy too. And they had to keep the camp holy. And yeah. But back to the question. We did get off subject quite often. But anyway, and the first thing that struck me, I think you're right though about when did everything go bad, because everything was good in the beginning. Everything he created, he saw was good, or he saw as good. But the first thing that struck me was the order. The order of the species. It was in Leviticus. It starts with the land animals and then goes to the water animals and then to the swarming animals, right? Well, in Genesis, the first created, and that's what he's talking about, is where they were created. First created was the fish, the water, and then the birds, and then the beasts. And that's the thing. The birds stayed in the middle, but the other two swapped places. That was the first thing that struck me when I read that passage. And the other one was then in creation it was good and God blessed it. And now he only blesses the clean. Well, now he blesses everything again for us. Right. But all right, now y'all are really going to have to help me on this next one, because I couldn't come up with an answer at all on it, okay? These rules permitted the Hebrew household a selection of meats one step below the exclusive menu permitted at the Lord's table, that would be the sacrificial animals, and one step above that available to the Gentiles. What is the significance of this diet assigned to the Israelites encamped between the tabernacle and the world? And in the wording of the question, they have kind of set up in the food that God was here, and the food sacrificed to him was here, and the Gentiles were here, and the food available to them was here, and the Israelites are in between. They're not only living in between God and the world, they're eating the stuff between God and the world, and that I just came up with. So I have no idea how to answer that. Catherine, do you have any further thoughts on that one?
I don't know. You just sit here and process it.
The significance of this diet assigned to the Israelites encamped between the tabernacle and the world. Right. What is the significance? I guess it's what is the significance
separation
of this diet is the question.
It's we as God's people, when we come to know Jesus as Lord and Savior, we are set apart. So I think that's just what they're emphasizing.
That's right. And he provides for you better than he does for the ones that don't believe in him.
Right.
Cool. That's a good point, Stephanie.
Needs, and that's out of grace and mercy, not
that's
because,
right. Yeah,
well, but it's still
it is how he does it.
Well, and though we don't have the dietary restrictions, it's like I said at the beginning of the study of Leviticus. This isn't to tell us that we have to follow those laws, although Jesus didn't come to do away with the law, but he came to edify it. there were things that were done away with because the sacrifice, the shed blood was for the remission of sin. And when Jesus died on the cross, that removes everyone's sin that wants to accept it, you know.
Right.
And so the animal sacrifices weren't necessary, but I think I made this point when we were studying the sacrifices. Our prayers are that sweet aroma that was going up to God in those sacrifices. That's what our prayers do. So Jesus said, shed the blood, and our prayers provide the sweet aroma. So there's still, the principle is still there.
Right.
And I think that's what the whole idea of studying Leviticus and these other chapters in the Old Testament. A lot of people say, "Oh, they don't have anything to do with our life today," but that's just not true.
Yeah.
God is still the same God He was then.
That's right.
And He still wants
And it's the
that
instruction
sweet
that He wants
aroma.
to
He
give us,
still
yeah.
wants our obedience. A lot of the things in the first two books of the Bible, Genesis and Leviticus, are about obedience. Okay? A lot of it is just purely, I want you to be obedient. Listen to what I say and do what
That's
I say.
right.
Believe what I
And
say.
exactly.
And if
Life will
we do
be
that,
better for you.
yes, for real, it will. Okay, so are we good with our answer on that one then? Okay. The Old Testament prophets repeatedly condemned Gentile nations for their sins against God's moral laws. But Gentile nations are never condemned for not observing dietary laws. Why were these dietary laws unique to Israel?
Well, once
Because they were
again,
His people.
yeah. Well, once again, we are to be set apart. You know, there's restrictions that affect us as God's people that don't.
Well,
Aren't
God's
expected.
moral laws
Yeah.
set us apart as well.
You know,
Very much.
But the Gentiles were condemned for not following those.
Well, with salvation comes responsibility, and we're set apart. We are called to a higher way of living, a higher way of being, a higher way of doing.
Well, my answer for that was the purpose of the dietary law was to remind the people that they were to keep themselves holy because the holy God lived among them. And if you remember that these, even the 10 Commandments weren't given because a man could actually keep them. That wasn't their reason for giving. And they did not, the law and keeping the law didn't save anyone. It didn't negate their sins one little bit.
It was a ruler. It showed us that we're missing the mark, and we cannot measure up, and we need. That's why it's so neat when if you're able to share your faith with somebody, is to actually, see, hey, how many of the 10 Commandments have you kept? And it makes you realize, because we want to compare ourselves to other people and say, well, I'm not as bad as Joe Blow or Sally Sue, but it shows us, oh wow. The measuring stick.
You're not. You're using the wrong measuring stick.
Yes.
And that's true. You can't get some people to understand. The Bible says your good deeds are as filthy rags to God.
Yeah.
And so, but you can't get secular people to understand that.
Right.
Well, I'm a good person.
Yeah.
But being a good person isn't the point. Have you accepted Christ is the point.
Well, that's why I like Living Waters for Great Comfort, and he talks about. So he asked them. So he asked them the $1 million questions.
Yeah.
He asked them, well, how? I'm trying to remember what the question was, but how many times have you ever stolen anything?
Yeah.
Yes. have you ever lied?
Yes.
Because what it is, then it's comparing us to God, and then it makes us realize when we're compared to God, we need Jesus, His holiness and salvation, because we aren't good in
Well, and I think a
ourselves.
lot of people don't understand too.
Right.
And the Bible teaches you the only way the only way for sins to be, the only way for remission of sin. I'm trying to phrase it right. But the only way you get remission of sin is through a blood sacrifice.
Right.
And that's what the sacrifices were to teach us, is that only blood can remove your sin. But the sacrificial animals, though they were unblemished, were not the perfect sacrifice. So that had to be done over and over again, time and time again.
And that's why Jesus' blood covered all mankind one time. He didn't have to die over and over again. He just had to die once.
Yeah.
And it was funny because I've been doing an online class with Child Evangelism Fellowship, and there is a verse, and I was trying to find it real quick, that talks about for the remission of sins there has to be blood. Blood has to.
The kids okay?
Yes,
Oh.
the kids are fine. You couldn't find the slow cooker.
Okay, so the next question then is, in a farming society, removal of dead animals is part of life. Note the repeated references to one who touches. And those are found in Leviticus chapter 11, verses 24, 27, 31, 36, and 39. And all those is just the places where it says you can't touch a carcass or
It makes you unclean.
yeah, it makes you unclean until evening. And that's touches dead animals or carries their carcass. Carries their carcasses in verses 25, 28, and 40. The text does not condemn the necessary removal of, for instance, a dead hyena from one's property or a dead mouse from one's food storage. Touching something unclean is not sinful, but every contact with a carcass rendered the individual unclean overnight. What would the Old Testament believer learn by being declared ritually unclean after every contact with death?
I'd say that death is not a wonderful thing.
Well, you have to remember, when they were unclean, they weren't allowed in the camp. They couldn't associate with their family or their friends or other believers. They weren't allowed in the presence of God.
Well, I think it
So
would.
death separates.
Right, it does. And it would move them to, okay, I need to get this right. I need to take care of this. I need to go get my sacrifice.
Well, and this is the thing, in touching of a carcass or a dead animal, you're unclean till evening. There's no sacrifice or anything to it. You're just unclean until evening. So what would a believer, an Old Testament believer, learn by being declared ritually unclean after every contact with death? And we're on the right track, I believe, there with try not to be unclean, I
would say keep short accounts. That means you. Well, it's even today.
Yeah, even today
And
we're
like-
called to keep short account.
Right, and like when I'm talking to Seth, I'll say, and he knows that, he talks about it too, but just that we need to literally, and do I do that? Do I go to the Lord every day and say, oh Lord, forgive me for getting angry today, or show me, is there anything today? Do I do that before I go to bed? Is there
Yeah.
anything today where I sinned against you that
I
maybe wasn't
need to
paying
get right
attention,
with
that I
it,
need to
yeah.
get right? Yeah.
Or is there any sin I've
Yeah,
committed against
right. Or
another
is there
person that I
right,
need to get right,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably my nightly prayer too, is, Lord, did I do everything right today?
And maybe that you need to to be alone for that reflection, for that,
Yeah.
the grieving period of whatever, to think about what has happened.
Right.
Well, my answer to that was that unclean was a temporary situation. I mean, it was, and there was nothing you could do about it. If you touched a carcass, you were unclean till evening. You had to stay out of camp. You had to, you couldn't associate or eat with your family. You had to do everything on your own, you know. So it was not so much a punishment as it was a way to keep that unclean from spreading to, you know. Sometimes just contamination from touching a dead body. You don't want to pass that on to other people. All right. One final category of dietary restriction is added at the end of the chapter: swarming things. From this category, nothing at all was to be eaten. Note the kind of swarming thing that is first on the list to be detested: whatever goes on its belly. In verse 42, y'all want to look that one up? Chapter 11, verse 42.
Whatever crawls on its belly, whatever goes on all fours, or whatever has many feet among all creeping things that creep on this earth, these you shall not eat, for they are an abomination.
Yeah. So why? Go ahead. Did you say
I
that?
was just
Okay.
through it.
So why, as a lesson on faith, might there be a special category of rejection for swarming things, starting with whatever goes on its belly? And it says you can compare it to Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 and
Is it
15.
the serpent that
Uh-huh.
Well,
led
when you
her
think it,
astray?
right, but you think of swarming things, where do they go? They're everywhere. They're getting into nasty stuff. So I would almost, that's sort of common sense, I would think. Because you'd almost have to, I don't know, if you did eat a swarming thing, you'd have to boil it or sterilize it first or something like that.
But why not there be a special category of rejection for swarming things? This is a special category, remember. And all is to be rejected from it. But it starts with the things that crawl on their belly. Okay. So my answer was, by the deceit of the serpent, sin entered the world. And he was cursed to crawl on his belly. Takes me a minute to figure out my writing.
Right.
But I think that's probably why it had a special category, because it goes back to sin entering the world and the way it entered the world. And the fact that God cursed the serpent to crawl on his belly all the days of his life. Okay,
Stay
whatever
away
the
like they
logic...
didn't.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I said, and we should stay away from him like they didn't.
Yeah. Well, and there was also enmity put between the woman and the serpent. And I guess that's why most women just shun serpents or snakes, you know, they just don't want to be around them. And when we studied that part of the Bible, we found out that it may not have been a snake at all. The Hebrew word that was used could have been any, I think, creature that walked on its hind legs or something, because it was upright. So like a dragon or something like that, a lizard.
Well, what was incredible that I learned over time when we were studying like the original Greek at some study, but I didn't realize this. Everybody gets down on the woman, like, why did she mess up and she caused all this chaos? Apparently, according to the original language, he was standing right next to her. And so did he say, stop, don't do that? He just let her do it?
And my take on it is
woman.
is the fact that God told Adam not to eat of the tree. He didn't tell Eve that. He told Adam that. And when Adam ate the apple, because sin entered the world through Adam. Okay, so it was when he ate the apple
He was supposed to leave.
that
his
was
wife.
actual disobedience.
Yeah.
So that was his disobedience, and that's what brought sin
Right.
into the world, was disobedience to God. And that's where we're all working to try to get back to, is not to be disobedient to God. All right, whatever the logic behind these dietary classifications, the faith lesson is stated in the summary, which is Leviticus chapter 11, verses 44 through 47. If somebody wants to read that for me.
For I am the Lord your God, so you must consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. Do not defile yourselves by any swarming creature that crawls on the ground, for I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God, so you must be holy, because I am holy. This is a law concerning animals, herds, all living creatures that move in the water, and all creatures that swarm on the ground. So in order to distinguish between the unclean and the clean, between the animals that may be eaten and those that may not be eaten.
Okay, so compare this reason with the similar statement in Leviticus chapter 20, verses 24 through 26, and the Apostle Peter's discussion of the dietary rules in Acts chapter 10, verses 9 through 29. When I have forgotten what I said now. Leviticus 20, 24 through
26.
26.
But I have said to you, you shall inherit their land, and I will give it to you to possess, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has separated you from the peoples. You shall therefore distinguish between clean animals and unclean, between unclean birds and clean, and you shall not make yourselves abominable by beast or by bird or by any kind of living things that creep on the ground, which I have separated from you as unclean. And you shall be holy to me, for I am the Lord. For I, the Lord, am holy, and have separated you from the peoples, that you should be mine.
Okay, and then Acts 10, 9 through 29. Acts is in the New Testament. And I'm still in the Old Testament. There we go. Right after John. Acts 9 through 29. That's going to be a long read.
The next day, as they were traveling and nearing the city, Peter went up to pray on the roof about noon. Okay. He became hungry and wanted to eat, but while they were preparing something, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven opened and an object that resembled a large sheet coming down, being lowered by its four corners to the earth. In it were all the four-footed animals and reptiles of the earth, and the birds of the sky. A voice said to him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "No, Lord," Peter said, "for I have never eaten anything impure and ritually unclean." Again, a second time the voice said to him, "What God has made clean, do not call impure." This happened 3 times, and suddenly the object was taken up into heaven. Is there further?
29.
Great. While Peter was deeply perplexed about what the vision he had seen meant, right away the men who had been sent by Cornelius, having asked directions to Simon's house, stood at the gate. They called out and asking if Simon, who was also named Peter, was lodging there. While Peter was thinking about the vision, the Spirit told him, 3 men are here looking for you. Get up, go downstairs, and go with them, with no doubts at all, because I have sent them. Then Peter went down to the men and said, Here I am, the one you're looking for. What is the reason you're here? They say, Cornelius, a centurion, an upright and God-fearing man who has a good reputation with the whole Jewish nation, was divinely directed by a holy angel to call you to his house and to hear a message from you. Peter then invited them in and gave them lodging. The next day he got up and set out with them, and some of the brothers from Joppa went with him. The following day he entered Caesarea. Now Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. When Peter entered, Cornelius met him, fell at his feet, and worshipped him. But Peter lifted him up and said, Stand up, I myself am also a man. While talking with him, he went in and found a large gathering of people. Peter said to them, You know, it's forbidden for a Jewish man to associate with or visit a foreigner, but God has shown me first that I must not call any person impure or unclean. That's why I came without any objection when I was sent for. So may I ask why you sent for me? Because, he wouldn't have gone. If he hadn't had that vision,
He would not have gone because that was his upbringing. And God is showing him through that vision that his upbringing was wrong. Mm-hmm. There's a new sheriff in town. Mm-hmm. So, in your own words, how were the dietary laws fulfilled at Christ's coming?
Well, it's sort of like the veil in the temple, if you think of that. When it was ripped, when he died on the cross, they said this veil, it was thick.
Yeah.
It wasn't just this little...
No, it's not a curtain. It was a veil.
And the thing, it was written, I think it was torn from bottom to top, which is really unusual. Usually if something's torn, it goes from top to bottom. But it was saying there's nothing, everybody's clean, everybody's holy. Jesus Christ has made a way. He's shed his blood. And so that... Well,
in the instance of the veil, he was saying, you no longer need a high priest. I'm your high priest.
Yep.
In the...
He brought people back to God through Jesus.
Okay, now remember that the dietary laws were given for what? To remind the Jewish people that they were in the presence of a holy God.
Right.
They had to go through a lot of stuff, a lot of things, to be in the presence of the holy God. Mm-hmm. Jesus fulfilled all of that when he died on the cross. Mm-hmm. At the shedding of Jesus' blood, all things were made clean. What God has blessed, let no man call common. And so I think that's our lesson there on the dietary laws, is that though we no longer have them, the reason we no longer have them is Jesus died on the cross for our sins. Okay. The reason we no longer have to live by the law, it's because we live under grace. Mm-hmm. That happened when he died on the cross. So it all comes back to, I think it's all pointing to God making the earth the way it was in the beginning. Mm-hmm. Jesus will set his kingdom up on earth at some point. And when he does, there will be no more sin in the world. It will be a perfect world. There will be no sorrow. There will be no sickness. There will be no death. Mm-hmm. And I think this is just a step towards that. I mean, everything that has happened since the cross has been building towards the second coming of Christ. And we now feel like that we're pretty close to the end times, if not living in the end times. Mm-hmm. So it's time to wake up. And it's time to pay attention to what's going on in the world around us, because the signs are there. And we won't know the hour or the day. That's for God only to know. Even Jesus didn't know that. that was for God only to know the day and the hour. But God knows everything from beginning to end.
Right.
The thing is, I listen to American Family Radio on FM 89.5 a lot, and I love it. And they keep remarking that I worked the election, and I just went to bed when I got home. Because I thought, oh great, it's gonna. You know how long it has been in the past for them to make a decision. I said I'll find out in the morning. I'm tired, but then I was shocked. I was close. I really feel, and a lot of people do, that God gave us mercy with him allowing, not that he's a perfect person, but that things were going so far, and God, and we deserved Camilla Harris, and God blessed us, and
Amen.
so I'm like, okay, we need to appreciate what God has shown us mercy when we really deserve judgment.
Well, and we will face judgment. There's a lot of
Yeah.
people that and I guess some people disagree that even the saved people will be judged. But the Bible talks in Revelations, it talks about the great white throne judgment, which is when God judges the world. It's when God separates the sinners from the saints.
But there's two different judgments.
But then Jesus will have a judgment seat as well, and he will judge his people for what they have done with what he has given them.
Right.
And there's examples of that all through the
that's
New
when
Testament.
He'll dole out rewards.
Yeah, it will be rewards or it would be demotions.
I do not know you.
Well, that will be the one. That will be the great white throne judgment when God says, "Depart from me, I never knew you."
Separates the sheep from the goats.
Yeah, but the saints' judgment, the judgment seat of Christ, is like Catherine said, where your rewards will come in. And we take those crowns and lay them at Jesus' feet. So, but no, it's also about our failures, because there will be people who will have their little that they were given taken away from them because they did nothing with it. And there will be others who will be greatly rewarded because they multiplied what was given to them by a lot, and this is the example of that is in the coins when the three servants were given coins, and I think 10 and 5 and 1. And I don't know if you're familiar with that story or not, Lisa, but it's where at the end the one that was given 1 coin buried it in the field. And so when the master came back to check on his investments, the one had doubled or tripled, and the second one had increased, but the one that was given 1 had just buried it in the field. And he said, because I knew you were a hard taskmaster and you would not want what you had not earned and all of this stuff, I buried it. Here's your talent back. And God took it away from him, so he had nothing, and gave it to the one who did the best. So this is a picture of kind of what we will be looking at, because we will have to account for what we've done with what we've been given. But a lot of people prefer to think that no, the saved can't be judged. Well, no, you're not judged for your sins. You're judged for your talents. Okay, so are we about done then?
I think so.
Anybody have any questions? Comments? All right, Catherine, why don't you close this in prayer then, and we'll dismiss and go our separate ways.
Dear gracious Heavenly Father,